We have arrived at the final roundtable of this two-day conference, tour de force, and I actually would like to begin with a round of applause for Betsy Anthony. Yay, Betsy. We have with us four extremely distinguished scholars and players in the field to talk about ITS archives in the future of Holocaust research. And it's a really unique opportunity for all of us to think through the issues of the last 2 days and discuss them with people of influence who will be making some of the decisions with regard to where we go from here. Starting with Rebecca Boehling. She's the director, as you know, of the International Tracing Service and currently on leave from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She's there a professor of history and was the founding director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities. She's the co-author of Life and Loss in the Shadow of the Holocaust, A Jewish Family's Untold Story in 2011, and A Question of Priorities, Democratic Reforms and Economic Recovery in Post-War Europe. Rebecca's comments will be followed by Johannes-Dieter Steinert, who's professor of modern European history and migration studies at University of Wolverhampton. He's the author of Deportation and Forced Labor, Polish and Soviet Children in Nazi Germany and Occupied Eastern Europe, and co-editor of both volumes of Survivors of Nazi Persecution in Europe After the Second World War, Landscapes After Battle. He will be followed by Paul Weindling, who's been working with ITS for many years. He's the Wellcome Trust research professor in the history of medicine at Oxford Brookes University and the author of the forthcoming Victims and Survivors of Nazi Human Experiments, Science and Suffering in the Holocaust, and John W. Thompson, Psychiatrist in the Shadow of the Holocaust, and Nazi Medicine and the Nuremberg Trial, From Medical War Crimes to Informed Consent. And our final word before we take questions from the audience will be from Paul Shapiro, the director of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. In addition to establishing the center as one of the world's preeminent research institutes, he is responsible for opening ITS to survivors and to the world. So with that, each will speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will have an open discussion. Beginning with Dr. Boehling, Director Boehling.
Director Boehling. Sometimes I feel like my identity in Germany, I'm die Direktorin, but anyway, I think I'm something different than just the Direktorin. But anyway, let me speak as perhaps first the Direktorin and talk about a mundane topic first, and that is that of citations. Many of us are here today as researchers, and I have been very aware, and maybe it's also the professor in me, that everyone has cited these sources differently. And we have recently made a decision at the ITS in Bad Arolsen to try to have a uniform system that will go across languages, et cetera, but using English as the primary, since that was the language originally of the ITS. And so I would like to suggest that you start off with the sub-collection number. Like we're back into class. So you don't have to say the word sub-collection, but just so you know, you get the sub-collection number and then a backslash, and then the document ID number. And again, you don't have to write the word doc ID. It will be apparent because one is much shorter than the other. And then again, backslash, and then ITS Digital Archive. This will be on our website if it isn't already. Under research, is it already on our website, Susanna?
No, we don't have the English word.
Oh, okay. Well, it doesn't need to be in English because it's no words. I mean, ITS Digital Archive. And then after that, one more backslash, and then the location. So in the case of Bad Arolsen, we put Bad Arolsen. I assume USHMM will probably prefer to put USHMM, Yad Vashem. I'm hoping Yad Vashem will go along with this. But wherever, Wiener Library, Christine. So that this is, you can do Wiener Library in London, whatever, if you need to differentiate further. But I think that kind of consistency for the digital documents would be the logical way. It's the way to find them, and we would all know what you're doing. You don't need to have the other numbers. It's already enough numbers to have to worry about. So you want to differentiate, though, clearly between collection or sub-collection, and then, or sub-unit, if you want to call it that, and then the doc ID, and then ITS Digital Archive. So enough of the boring stuff, but I think I watched as each person had something else, and I thought, boy, we really need to work on this. So this is my suggestion. I've been amazed by this conference, and I want once again to thank the Holocaust Museum and the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies for co-sponsoring this with us. It's really been a delight to be here again. I think that there are many still misunderstandings about the ITS, and one of my many tasks is trying to dispel some of the myths. As nice as it is to go to the ITS and to find materials from all over the world, really, please don't ever think that the ITS intends to be comprehensive. We are not currently adding to our collections. That doesn't mean that we might not at some point, but at this point we are not. And we're just trying to organize what we have. And as you know, we have a lot. So we're busily focusing on indexing. But I don't want you to think, oh, why don't you have that? Then I could just go to the ITS or just be in the digital archive and find everything. That was never the intent of the International Commission or of the collectors. The primary collections are, of course, what was collected at the end of the war in the first several years. And then, of course, it's being added to by these various tracing documents, et cetera. So please bear that in mind. Of the themes that I've been thinking about as I've listened and read the last several days that I think are so important is I think the theme of gender has come up. Some of you know that I also do gender and women's studies. So the theme of gender has come up in almost all the papers, either directly or indirectly. I don't know if the ITS documents will tell us new things about what we think about the role of gender in the Holocaust and in Nazi persecution. But I already think that just listening in the last couple of days, we transcend these categories somewhat, or we have to sort of shift in the way that we look at them, whether or not we're looking at Jews as forced labor or as slave labor, I would tend to say, and women in all sorts of fields. We just had that comment in the last session. I think one of the things that I've been surprised by in a way is the focus of most of the papers that were given here, and in fact most of the papers that were offered as ideas for coming to this conference, and we weren't able to invite everyone, and that is that most of the materials pertain to either the end of the war or the immediate post-war period. And this is an interesting thing. It's interesting in terms of course, materials that come in the post-war period can only come from survivors usually. So that, of course, means that the end of the war is going to be more prominent, and of course the post-war period. But I think I liked the way the question was posed, what is the end phase? What do we mean by the end phase? And of course there's a military end phase and there's a civilian end phase, and these are very different things. These arguments against chaos theory, and yet also admitting there was chaos and you lost contact with Berlin. Things happened that were not centralized. How do we complicate our picture? And I would say we need to complicate our picture of the home front of the war, of the labor front. There are all these different words, and I don't mean the German labor front in that way. So I think that I hesitate to use the word gray zones because, of course, it has so many other connotations, but there are so many different levels of variation between black and white that this kind of conference in the last several days has really made clear. There was less chaos than perhaps we thought, more structure, but it depended on where the Allied lines were in these last months and in perhaps even years of the war. I think that it's important when we think about forced labor or slave labor to also recognize that these are fluid categories. I think about a close friend of mine who always was trying to find out what happened to her father, and he was Jewish, he was communist, and he ended up in Würzburg in a labor camp, not for Jews. So, we tend to think, okay, if you were this, then open this drawer and that's where you went. But it's not that neat. It's just not that neat. And as we've seen over the last several days, these categories are constantly in flux. People, just like I encountered when I came to the ITS, that I had all of these tracing staff who were specialized in one aspect of a particular concentration camp, incarceration, or forced labor, or the DPs. But I said, there's many people that fit into all these categories, and we have to approach these people holistically. We have to, and we've seen that over the last several days. I think that, sure, there are people that immediately were deported and went to their deaths, but there are so many complicating layers of identities. That's another thing that's very much in flux. How people identified themselves. When I first became aware of our displaced persons collection, I was just amazed at how people described themselves. I mean, we can look, even just in the ITS, and see from year to year how, maybe even from month to month, how the same person might identify themselves differently. So it's not just others, and of course, if they're actually writing themselves or if someone else is writing for them, what they may decide they are, just as the Nazis decided what you were, in some cases, post-war officers, allies, etc., also decided what you were, regardless of what you said. So I don't want to take up any more time, but I think that the question of killing through labor is also a theme that came up in many, many papers. And I kept thinking about Leben unwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. Well, labor was important, especially at the end of the war. It was very important to the German economy. It became, in some ways, a short-term goal of more important than killing Jews. And yet, it was an indirect way of killing Jews and of killing the other unwanted, the other Leben unwertes Leben, according to the Nazis. So again, this to me is one of those things that we have to say, when are we talking about, why are we talking about, changing priorities, how much we can't have drawers. All of this is constantly in flux. So this is a plea, I guess, for the dynamism of this time. And I'm not just talking about the war itself, but also the post-war. So thank you very much.
So I think I'm the second in the row, and before you get me totally wrong, because I'm an old grump, as many as you know, I would like to say that I enjoyed the papers. You did a wonderful job, and I found all the papers very interesting. I say that because my second remark, and I hope you do not misunderstand me, Paul has opened a big archive. But do we have the big questions? Do we really have the big research questions for this big archive? Sometimes I think we are just scratching the top of the iceberg. We are interested in a tree and do not see the whole forest. And maybe we can put our thoughts together tomorrow in the more workshop. In the workshop from 10 to 1, maybe to collect some ideas that go beyond our particular research interests. We have heard at the beginning, and I agree, we are one family, and I think we complement each other very well in our work, but we do not sing from the same hymn sheet. We are very different. We have heard interesting papers from colleagues who are interested in documenting things. documenting as many camps as possible, documenting as many ghettos as possible, documenting as many life stories as possible within a context. And then we have another group who are interested in education. And the third group, let me call them the more traditional historians, maybe at universities, who are not so much interested in documenting, they're interested in generalizations. From the basic, and therefore I think we complement each other, based on life stories and other sources, we try to generalize. We try to ask what is new. If there's nothing new in a topic, why do it? Somebody from a museum would think in a quite different way. If there is no innovation in a research question, why do it? If there's any innovation in a method, do it. And all those of you who are familiar with research exercise frameworks, we have to ask for the impact of our work. We have listened to papers of a group of colleagues, I belong to them, who for a particular research topic visit maybe 5 archives or 10 archives or 15 archives or whatever, and ITS is one of them. Just one of them. Grab what you find, be happy with it, and move on to the next archive. And then we have heard papers from colleagues who are interested in a particular area of ITS archive, in a collection of early testimonies, in special questionnaires, in card indexes, etc., etc. And some of them, and I found that very interesting because I thought about it, some spoke in more or less detail, unfortunately in less detail, about quantitative methods. ITS is an archive that contains mass data. And shouldn't we encourage experts in the field of quantitative methods for joining a workshop and put their brains together? What is possible to do with these mass data? What can we find out about displaced persons, about Holocaust survivors, about inmates of prisoners of camps, about transportations from one camp to the next camp, and so on the basis of how can quantitative methods help in doing that. And I think that might be a future of Holocaust research, one of the possible futures of Holocaust research. And this final roundtable has the topic ITS archives and the future of Holocaust research. Let me add three more points. I think ITS and the committee should think about the access. Why on earth has a colleague to travel 20 hours to reach the next access point? Why on earth is it not possible for somebody in Russia to go to Moscow, for somebody in Ukraine to go to Kiev, for somebody in Salzburg to go to Vienna? Why not? Are we really such an exclusive club? If we have enough money, fine, let's take the next plane, travel 20 hours, that's great. But colleagues in Kiev can't do that. They do not have the money to go to Berlin. They are excluded from research, and I think that's something ITS should think about. Why is it not possible? You talked in the beginning, in the words of welcome, about making ITS material accessible online.
It's going to be.
When? In the meantime, perhaps, before you realize the big plan, do an intermediate step. Allow us from our computers in our offices to have a link for a period of time to the data collection. Maybe for 3 months, maybe for 6 months, whatever. I like to travel from Wolverhampton to London. It takes me 2 hours. It's great in London. It's fine. I like to work together with Christine Schmidt. That's absolutely fine. But I would prefer to have the link to my computer in my office. Finding aids. I think that's a point we should talk about. Finding aids. There is a lot of room for improvement to do it, and I think everybody will agree. And finally, if we think about the places where huge collections of documents are, like here in this museum, like in Yad Vashem, for example, there's always a very strong research department. Do we have that in Bad Arolsen? We have Susanne Urban, and we treasure her work. But I like to see 10 Susanne Urban there as a very, very strong research department that works together with this place and Yad Vashem and other places. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the organisers first, and it's a double thanks for the conference, but also for opening the ITS and making it the Holocaust historian dream in many ways as a centre for best practice, and one in which there is increasing accessibility. I think it's a technological miracle as it stands, but of course we have got great expectations. I myself am working in an area which, when the ITS was announced that it would open, it was said that medical experiments were the one area which was going to be excluded. But of course, I think it's a tribute to the visionary nature of the work, that it is an area that is possible to research. And with Alexandra Löwenau and a couple of other committed historians, our little team has identified 27,759 victims of coerced medical research. But the point that I wish to make is that it is possible to reconstruct whole victim cohorts. And I think this is really important. And it's an opportunity for ambitious research. For example, if we take the work of different concentration camp categories, the asocials, for example, we have exemplary, the policies, we have exemplary biographies, but not the totality of the group. And we need this totality also not just as cumulative, but also over time, that we can look at the temporal element. And the other significant thing is to be able to connect the different locations of arrest and incarceration, so that, of course, the memorials we've heard, you're all very, very keen on having your share of the documents, absolutely right. But of course, what one needs is the interconnectedness, the transfers that are going on constantly of prisoners between different institutions. What is the momentum of these transfers? Why do they take place? It would be ideal if one could work at that level. The other element that we've heard, which is closely related to my area of work, is a lot about food, clothing, health conditions. Again, we need to know much more about these very, very basic elemental factors of life, which after all was were being, how can I say, it was part of the withdrawal of this, of any element that was life-sustaining to existence. So we're dealing with existence in extreme situations. I think it would be, we need to know, for example, shoes, there's Anne Sudrov's work, but there is a great scope on the study of material objects. Clothing, for example. Clothing is filthy, it's louse-infected, sometimes one sees exhibits of clothing. They're very clean, generally. I don't think that's how it... that was not the reality, to be able to understand much more of existence under these extreme conditions. And there are, within the ITS, wonderful resources. I have worked a great deal on the test records of the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS at Reiskow in Auschwitz. It is absolutely colossal. So you can study the typhoid test being done on kitchen staff, the Wassermann test being done on the camp brothel staff, the date, the camp number of the person, the results being sent back. It gives one a very, and I use it to, for example, to reconstruct Mengeles twins. You can reconstruct whole victim groups from these shreds, from these little certificates, but it gives one, there is a potentiality there. And of course, we've heard when we've discussed there is more broadly the Krankenrevier in the concentration camp, the Krankenrevier as a locus of extermination with lethal injections on the one hand, but also the Krankenrevier, these camp hospitals as a focus of resistance. And an institution which is often universal in these camps have very, very complicated and they need reconstruction, I think. So as many other elements of the camp, kitchens, and you can think sort of endlessly of that. Moving to the post-war period, Section 4.2 of the ITS is something that's been of great fascination to me on the medical experiments. It shows the ITS, the quality of ITS information being done in the 60s and 70s, and also the way it was working for compensation, how it was the basis for the certification, its own knowledge basis. And I think that level of understanding, how far did the ITS grasp, was it willing to grasp in its staff members? And I am often quite critical of the thinness of this knowledge basis, although it could have done a great deal more. Just two more issues. One is that we've talked about the importance of naming, of opening historical windows. And I was very relieved that Rebecca gave important reassurances on access to named records. It remains a great problem for Holocaust-related research. In Germany, it is not possible to name whole categories of victims. Illegal even. It is illegal to publish the names of the Stasi list of euthanasia victims. There will be no death book of euthanasia victims. And you can say that for many, and why is it? And to give one example of the importance, among the first victims of gassings at the Brandenburg prison were Jewish victims. Yet their names in the new exhibition are the names which are withheld. And why are they withheld? Because a German local archive, which was the holding institution, refuses to divulge these names. So that for a key element of Holocaust history, we are lacking names, and not only we as scholars, but it is family members, it is descendants, it is, I think, we're deprived. So I think that we need, how can I say, further, the ITS, I think, is important as a vast store of names, but to be able to, how can I say, to enrich the commemoration memory and to provide family members with access, to provide school children, students, not just scholars, but of course we have an interest, to be able to work with names and to revise a generation of memorials in the case of euthanasia, which I think urgently do need to be revised. And I think finally, you have a wonderful archive with the ITS. But what would be wonderful also if other archives would actually grasp its possibilities, and so that although you may not wish to take in other collections, would it not be significant if, say, the Berlin Document Center collections were also digitized, were also that there would be multiple, as part of that there would be a complementarity of other significant collections so that one could fully reconstruct in the round whatever is necessary to do. And I think with the ITS you can say we have best practice, come on, rise to our standards. Thank you.
Wow. Well, there's a lot there, and I have a few points I'd like to make myself. Let me comment first on this whole issue of access and privacy. First, by saying that access rules for ITS were determined based on a consensus reached after a very long, very brutal discussion of all the possibilities. And the possibilities ranged from taking the worst possible restrictive features of the national legislations and practices of 11 countries and saying, okay, we'll go to the lowest common denominator, which of course would mean that no one would ever see anything or even seek to see anything, to an approach that was advocated essentially by only a single country, which was the United States, that this material is of such significance and having it available is of such public interest in terms of the ability to generate public good, that it should all be completely open. The end result is that it's all completely open. At Arolsen, with the one exception of that 25-year restriction, not from when the material came to Arolsen, but when the material was generated. So a letter that arrived 2 years ago, you would not be able to see. But the documentation that might relate to the person being asked about, that documentation being more than 25 years old, you would be able to see. The genesis of the 25 years, again, it was a very difficult debate and discussion that in the end boiled down to several of the governments not wanting people to be able to see that government's own inquiries about material at ITS. So there was a national governmental concern that political leadership still alive might have what their interests were or interests were not revealed if that material was totally open. In 25 years, well, that seemed to satisfy that concern without violating the openness of the historical material that is in Arolsen. At this point, and I'll just go on for another minute, and I hope they'll give me an extra minute to do it. The notion that there would be only one physical repository of this material in each member country was a proposal not by this museum, was a proposal by a set of countries that thought that would never be acceptable. And it was accepted precisely to say, okay, now we've got agreement. We have an expression in the United States. Once the horse is out of the barn, it's very difficult to put it back in. And indeed, that's what's happened now, so that in subsequent negotiation and subsequent decision-making by the International Commission, first there was an agreement that distance access of the type that you've talked about would be possible. And secondly, that internet access would be possible. The final feature was whatever the commission, whatever rules the commission set applied to Arolsen alone. And access in the member countries according to that country's own archival laws and practices. So in effect, in the US and in Israel, this material is totally accessible. In European countries, well, there are a variety of restrictions, and you've talked about some of them. If this material, if there was a copy of this material in the Bundesarchiv, you'd have a very difficult time using it. But of course, 150 miles away at Arolsen, it's there to be utilized with the. So it's a very complicated issue, and it was a very complicated issue. Someone raised the question of ownership. The treaties all say that the fact that material has been placed in Arolsen has no effect on ownership. So, and no one has wanted to enter that debate, because who owns, for example, the captured German records taken at the end of the war by Allied authorities of different countries? Is that war booty? Well, it's never been formally returned, even though physically it's been returned. Or is it Germany that owns those records? So the issue is just very complicated. And of course you have the massive post-war material. Who owns that? ITS? Well, what is ITS? It's an organization of international character, whatever that means, governed by 11 countries serving on a board. So some of those fundamental issues have been addressed by not addressing them. Let me react a little bit to the papers. The issue of the mass movements of lots of people of all kinds came up again and again. And when you think about the longue durée of this archival material, if we could somehow get ourselves out of the practice of saying, well, I'm going to look at the labor material, or I'm going to look at the camp material, I'm going to look at the DP material, and look at that longue durée right up until today, there would be a lot of potential that would go beyond the I would say more narrow perspective of just trying to burrow down to further detail in a particular piece of this documentation. I think it's important to recognize, and Jennifer Rogers' paper made this clear, that ITS served many political purposes. The documentation that's there definitely served as a recruitment resource for Western and in some cases Eastern Bloc countries for a period of time, as we and they sought to recruit people that would be good for our countries, and not all of those people, of course, were victims of persecution. Many of them were persecutors themselves. The point that Dieter made about not seeing ITS as an isolated resource is critically important. This is one piece of a massive archival puzzle, and finding the places where it abuts other collections and other archival resources, and on top of that, other kinds of resources, testimony, for instance, memoirs, diaries. I mean, that can really lead to quite exciting scholarship. Two final points. I think from these papers, my sense is that, and from the discussions that we've had and the discussions that we have at the museum and with other holders, we're just beginning to break down the myths about ITS that were fostered and became so strong during the period when no one could really explore what is in these materials. Well, what are some of those myths? I mentioned one the other day, that it's just a bunch of name cards and lists of names. So why bother to explore it? Another one is that it's material that pertains in an overwhelming way to what happened in the western part of Europe. But how many papers did we hear where you could feel that strong echo of the East, or see the pre-existence of people who are brought to the West, but they're brought to the West from the East? I mean, so many of the labor papers, so many of the Death March papers and so on. Another myth, of course, is that there are no perpetrators, no records about perpetrators in ITS. Well, the fact that the mission was described as collect the names of victims meant that there was a systematic practice of not identifying or recording the names of perpetrators in the records. You can't, everyone who studies the Holocaust understands you can't separate the perpetrators and the victims. The victims wouldn't have been victims if they were not in contact with the perpetrators. And the last one is, and here I think all the papers contribute, the last of those strong myths is that there's no way to look at this material except through name search. And each paper, in one way or another, chipped away at that notion by aggregating material, by disregarding names. Many of the concerns about individual names that people have come from the fact that the notion is out there that the only thing that's relevant here are people's names. For most scholars, individual names, if you're looking for those grand projects that Dieter made reference to, the individual names are not what's significant. It's the experience that you can find. Last point. These collections and the fact that only today, 75 years later, do we have a chance to look at them and try to learn from them, for me, are a very strong reminder of the long legacy that failure to address or prevent genocidal acts, mass murder, mass killings at an international scale, long legacy that kind of experience leaves. I mean, we are 3 generations later and just beginning to explore these records because it was more convenient to not have them explored for a long period of time. And there's something there that I think we can take away from this conference, recognizing that you look around the world and you see genocidal acts and mass killing and mass displacement of people taking place on a very regular basis, with the international community still not not effective in responding. If we fail today in the manner in which there was failure in the era of the Holocaust, it's not just my grandchildren, but the grandchildren of the youngest person in the room here will be wrestling with the consequences. And I think that's something that these documents and this resource can be put to work to teach people. Thank you.
So before we open it up, I had some thoughts as listening to all of you. I like Dieter Steinert's question about we should think about what are the big questions, what is really going to engage next generation's student and next generation's researcher, because that is what they will be asking. They will be asking what is new about this when we are standing in front of them presenting the material. So that is something I think it's really correct to keep in mind all the time. A couple of two themes that weren't mentioned that just have struck me recently. Susanna Urban did mention linguistics, and I was struck by that in looking at the 1.1.0.7s on questions to survivors of Auschwitz, and the title of the questionnaire was Fragen an alle Auschwitzer, questions to all Auschwitzers. You would never see something phrased that way now, and the way it was in a 1950s form. And I think just something, having scholars of linguistics, this could be quite interesting for them. I was struck in reading all the papers that the largest number of documents in ITS, please correct me if I'm wrong, are the tracing and documentation files, something like 3 million. And they were, and myself included, the least used by all of us at this conference. And I think it's because we're still a little bit intimidated, a little bit afraid, not quite sure what to do with these massive TD files on restitution. But there is something that can be and should be done with them. I'm trying to think of this for a chapter for the volume, because they are really underutilized so far. The third and the fourth point tie into, again, to what Johannes-Dieter Steinert said on access. I, too, noticed that many of the papers focused on one subunit, maybe two subunits, and I don't think it's because there's a lack of brain power in the room or lack of interest. I think we can all agree there's plenty of that. And it comes back to that search function and indexing issue. It's still, because it's so new, it's not easy to figure out how to look at a particular question across subunits 0 through 6. And the papers that did that the most were from people who used the collection almost every day. And it's just a matter of practice. And I suppose that my last point would be, let's be fair to ITS. Let's be fair in the sense that we are asking things of this archive that we would never ask of a paper collection up on the 5th floor here. With respect, to think that a collection on the 5th floor would be available on every desktop across the world is something for the future, but no one would expect it today. And I think we have to be fair with regard to ITS the same way. It's going to take some time for this collection to be accessible in a digital way, the same way we might imagine. And anyone who's worked with Ausarchiv knows why having it on your desktop doesn't really help until you understand Ausarchiv. So I think I would just say I'm impressed, tremendously impressed with the progress that has been made in 5 years on this collection. And Betsy and I joke frequently, it makes us laugh or cry every other day. And considering that, I think researchers have made long strides, and I think we'll go far. So that's really all I would like to add, and maybe I'm sure you have plenty to say yourselves. So